Okay, imagine this. You're walking down a street in New Orleans.
Yeah.
It's 1866, a hot summer day. The Civil War's over, but things are still, well, tense.
Yeah.
You see armed white men, some of them former Confederates, and across from them, black Civil War veterans.
Hmm.
These veterans, they're just trying to, exercise their rights, to assemble, to participate in this constitutional convention.
Yeah.
But things get out of control, and it turns into a massacre.
Oh, wow.
Dozens are killed. This isn't the Civil War. It's Reconstruction. And it's a period we don't talk about enough, even though it shaped, who we are today.
Absolutely.
So today we're diving into that, the Reconstruction era, and we're focusing on President Andrew Johnson, the guy who had to pick up the pieces after the Civil War.
A tough job, for sure.
Yeah, no kidding. So what you described, it really shows how the end of the war didn't magically fix everything.
Right. It wasn't just about rebuilding buildings and roads. It was about, rebuilding society.
Right. A society divided, about slavery, about racial inequality, all that.
Exactly. That's where the real challenge was.
So let's go back a bit. Lincoln's assassinated, which suddenly puts Johnson in the White House.
Right.
Now, Lincoln had his plan, the 10% plan.
Right.
It focused on bringing the South back into the Union, not on punishing them.
Mm.
But Johnson, who's a Southern Democrat, he had a very different idea, didn't he?
Oh, he did. Even Lincoln's plan, which was already pretty lenient, was controversial among his own party.
Yeah, I bet.
Many Republicans, especially the radical Republicans in Congress, thought it was way too soft on the Confederacy. They wanted to hold the South accountable, make sure former slaves were protected, really dismantle the old power structures down there.
And you have to wonder, what if Lincoln had lived? Would things be different?
We can only speculate, but it's a fascinating thought.
So with Johnson in charge, things change. His views on race, well, they were complicated. He hated the Southern aristocracy, but, well, he didn't believe in equality for black Americans either.
Yeah. His background really shaped those views.
Oh, so.
Well, he saw Reconstruction as a chance to give poor white Southerners more power, the people he related to. He wanted to punish the wealthy elite, who he blamed for the war, but, that didn't mean he was going to fight for racial justice.
Right. And so, almost right away, Johnson gives amnesty to most Confederates, letting them get their political rights back, and, well, they just slide right back into power.
That was a huge blow to those in Congress who wanted to see some consequences for the rebellion.
Yeah, slap in the face, pretty much.
Exactly. And this is where things start to get really heated between Johnson and Congress.
Oh.
Congress, now with more and more of these radical Republicans, saw this as a betrayal. They were fighting for civil rights, for preventing the South from just going back to how things were.
They were not going to back down.
Nope. And this sets the stage for this huge power struggle. And, well, this leads to Johnson becoming the first U.S. president to be impeached.
Wow, first president to be impeached. It's hard to believe all this happened so soon after the war. But before we get into the impeachment, let's talk about the Black Codes.
Right.
These were laws in the South that were basically trying to bring back slavery, but with a different name.
Yeah, they were designed to keep black people from having real freedom, to keep white people in control.
Like how?
They had curfews, made it hard to own land, restricted where people could go. They could even arrest and force black people to work for minor things.
That's all.
It was a direct attempt to go around the 13th Amendment, the one that ended slavery.
It's shocking how quickly they put those codes into place. Like, the second federal troops left, the South went right back to its old ways. And Johnson, instead of doing something about it, he ignored it.
His inaction gave the South even more confidence and made the radical Republicans in Congress even angrier. They saw the Black Codes as a direct attack on everything they had fought for.
And this leads to, well, some big fights between Johnson and Congress, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Bill.
Those were key moments for sure.
So the Freedmen's Bureau, that was to help former slaves, give them education, health care, help them find jobs and homes. And the Civil Rights Bill, that was to give citizenship and equal rights to everyone born in the U.S., no matter their race.
They were landmark pieces of legislation, really aimed at dismantling white supremacy and giving black Americans a real chance at equality.
So Johnson vetoed both, right?
He did. Those vetoes were a big deal. It showed how different his ideas about Reconstruction were from what the radical Republicans wanted. It was basically a declaration of war. And it set things in motion that would lead to his impeachment.
It's like one of those slow-motion train wrecks. You see it coming, but can't stop it.
Ah.
But before we talk about the impeachment, there's one more thing we need to cover. The 14th Amendment.
Ah, yes. the 14th Amendment.
Seems like it was a direct response to the Black Codes and to Johnson just ignoring the rights of Black Americans.
It absolutely was. The 14th Amendment was a big change in how we thought about citizenship and equal rights in this country. It was a powerful tool to fight against those Black codes and make sure Black Americans had their rights protected.
Okay, but remind me, what did it actually say? I'm a little foggy on the details.
It's pretty simple, really, but it had huge effects. It said that anyone born in the U.S. or who becomes a citizen is a citizen, no matter their race. And it said that states can't take away anyone's equal rights under the law. That meant no more laws that discriminated against people because of their race. It was a big deal.
So it shifted the power, giving the federal government more control over protecting people's rights, even for the states.
Right. Back then, the idea that the federal government could tell states what to do about civil rights, that was a radical idea.
And that's why Johnson hated it, right?
Exactly. He believed in states' rights and saw the 14th Amendment as the federal government overstepping its boundaries. He actually campaigned against it, told states not to ratify it, but thankfully they didn't listen to him.
It's interesting how Johnson said he supported Black people, but then, with the 14th Amendment and everything, his actions told a different story.
Yeah, it's like he was living in a different world.
To really understand his attitude, I think we have to talk about his meeting with Frederick Douglass.
Oh, that's a key moment.
It shows how hard it was to make progress toward equality.
It really does. You have Douglass, this amazing speaker and leader for abolition, going into this meeting hoping to convince Johnson to support letting Black men vote.
I can only imagine how frustrating that must have been for Douglass, trying to get the President of the United States to do the right thing.
It was a clash of two completely different visions for America, and it showed just how much racism there was even at the highest levels of government.
So let's hear about it. Set the scene. What happened at this meeting?
It was February 7th, 1866, at the White House. Douglass went with a group of Black leaders to meet with Johnson and talk about Black voting rights. The tension was thick, and the conversation, well, it really showed how far apart these two men were when it came to race and equality.
It's like watching history happen right in front of you.
It really is. It shows how complex and challenging this era was. It shows how fragile progress can be and how strong prejudice can be.
So how did it start? Who spoke first?
George T. Downing, one of the delegates, he started the conversation. He was respectful but firm. He talked about how they hoped Black people would be able to vote everywhere in the country, how it was a matter of justice, of national unity.
He was trying to appeal to Johnson's sense of fairness, I guess.
He was. He was looking for some common ground.
And Douglass, how did he approach it?
Douglass, as always, he was very eloquent and persuasive. He recognized how tough Johnson's position was. He said, "Mr. President, I come to you as a representative of the colored people of the United States, a people who have been loyal and true to this government during its recent trials and who now stand before you, humble petitioners for the exercise of the elective franchise."
So he was reminding Johnson that Black Americans had been loyal, that they had sacrificed for the country during the war, like they deserved a voice in the government.
Right. He was making a moral argument, but also a practical one. He connected Black suffrage to the future of the country. He said, "We are asking for the right of suffrage, not only as a matter of justice to ourselves, but as a matter of safety to the Republic."
Smart strategy. He was saying that not giving Black men the vote would be unjust and dangerous for the whole country.
It was, but it didn't work. Johnson, he was so stuck in his own prejudices that he just couldn't see Black men as equals, as people who deserve to vote.
Okay, so what did Johnson say? What were his responses?
Well, get ready, because it's pretty bad. He goes on this long, rambling, and really contradictory defense of his views on race. At one point, he even says that he did more for his slaves than they did for him when he was a slave owner.
Seriously?
He said, "I was their Moses, leading them out of the land of Egypt."
Did he just compare himself to Moses?
He did. It's completely ignoring how terrible slavery was. It's like classic paternalism.
Yeah, wow. And then he said what?
He goes on to say that poor white Southerners had it worse than enslaved Black people, which is just unbelievable.
I can't believe the president was saying this stuff. And how was Douglass reacting?
He stayed calm, but you can hear the frustration in his voice as he tries to reason with Johnson. Then Johnson asks Douglass, "Don't you think it is better for your race to be scattered among the whites than to be all together?"
What? That's such a condescending question.
It is. It's like Johnson couldn't imagine that Douglass, who had lived through slavery, could understand the South.
And what did Douglass say?
Douglass, he just replies, "Mr. President, I have lived both ways. I have lived among the whites in the North, and I have lived among the colored people in the South, and I must say that I have never seen any disposition on the part of colored people to congregate together, except when they were compelled to do so by the white people.
Perfect response. He doesn't even need to explain himself.
Hmm.
Just the fact that he has to answer that question, well, it says it all.
Exactly. But it's like nothing is getting through to Johnson. He refuses to budge on black voting rights.
He's stuck in the past, holding on to these racist ideas.
He is. He then says that giving black men the vote would create a war of races. He was terrified of black people having any political power.
And Douglas, I bet he was getting fed up with this by now.
He was. He responded to Johnson's fear-mongering by saying, "Mr. President, I do not wish to create a war of races. I wish to prevent it. And I believe that the best way to prevent it is to give to the colored people the same rights and privileges that are enjoyed by the white people."
He's saying that equality is the answer, not the problem.
Exactly. But Johnson wasn't ready to hear it. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Douglas and his group hadn't convinced Johnson of anything. Their ideas about a just and equal America were just too different from Johnson's messed up view of race. And to make things worse, as Douglas and the others were leaving, Johnson was heard muttering to someone else, "Those damn sons of bitches thought they were going to come in here and make a man out of me."
What a jerk. I mean, it just shows how little respect he had for these black leaders, even someone as respected as Frederick Douglass. It's like he thought any attempt to talk about black rights was a personal attack on him.
It really does. He couldn't see black Americans as anything but a threat to his own power.
A lot of historians think this meeting with Douglass is one of the worst moments ever for a president. David Blight, who wrote a biography about Douglass, even called it a tragic performance of presidential racism.
It was. It's a dark spot on Johnson's record, and it shows how deeply rooted racism was, even after a war fought to end slavery. But the fight for equality didn't stop there. Congress realized they couldn't trust Johnson to do anything about Reconstruction, so they took charge, especially with the 14th Amendment.
It's fascinating how that amendment, the one we talked about earlier, became so important during Reconstruction. It was like a weapon against those black codes popping up all over the South.
It was. It completely changed how the federal government could protect civil rights, even against the states.
So just to go over it again, the 14th Amendment said everyone born in the U.S. is a citizen, regardless of race, and states can't take away anyone's equal rights. It was a direct hit on those black codes, trying to secure the progress made during the war.
Exactly. And its impact went way beyond Reconstruction. It set the stage for the civil rights movement in the 1900s and is still a cornerstone of American law today.
It's amazing to think that something so important came out of such a chaotic time. It's like something good rising from the ashes.
It is. But we have to remember, it wasn't easy to get it passed. People like Andrew Johnson fought hard against it. He saw it as the federal government having way too much power.
Every step forward during Reconstruction, it seemed like there was someone trying to drag the country back into the past.
It was a constant struggle, and that's why the fight between Johnson and Congress was so important. It was about what kind of country America was going to be after the Civil War.
And it was happening while racial violence was getting worse in the South. We talked about that massacre in New Orleans, but that wasn't all. There were riots in Memphis, attacks on black communities everywhere. Johnson's policies weren't protecting anyone.
Sadly, you're right. The violence against black Americans during Reconstruction shows that ending slavery didn't magically erase racism and white supremacy.
It's heartbreaking to think about how hard it must have been for black Americans to keep fighting for their rights when things were so dangerous.
Their strength and determination are truly inspiring. But it also shows us that the work of Reconstruction is unfinished. Systemic racism is still a problem today.
It makes you wonder, what if those fighting for a better Reconstruction had succeeded? Would America be different today?
That's a tough question that historians are still trying to figure out. But it's clear that the problems of Reconstruction weren't fully solved.
So back to Johnson and Congress. He vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Bill and campaigned against the 14th Amendment. What did Congress do? They didn't just give up, did they?
Oh, no. Congress, especially the radical Republicans, they were determined to limit Johnson's power. They saw him as standing in the way of progress.
Like watching a political thriller. Two powerful forces going head to head, trying to outsmart each other.
The stakes were incredibly high, and it all came to a head with the Tenure of Office Act in 1867.
The Tenure of Office Act, okay. I remember hearing about that, but remind me, what was it all about?
It was a way to control Johnson, maybe even get him out of office. The act said the president couldn't fire certain officials like cabinet members without the Senate's approval.
So they were trying to stop him from appointing people who wouldn't support their vision for Reconstruction. But why this act specifically?
Because they wanted to protect Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War.
Oh, right, Stanton. He was loyal to Lincoln, one of the few left in Johnson's cabinet.
And he wanted a much stronger Reconstruction than Johnson did.
So Stanton was like a constant reminder of what could have been if Lincoln was still president.
Exactly. Johnson hated him and wanted him gone, but he couldn't just fire him because of this new law. And that's where things get interesting.
So what did Johnson do? He wasn't just going to sit back and take it, was he?
Nope. He never backed down from a fight, especially when he thought his power was being threatened.
So he decided to challenge this Tenure of Office Act directly.
He did. He tried to get around it by suspending Stanton and appointing General Lorenzo Thomas, who agreed with him more, as the temporary Secretary of War. It was a risky move.
It sounds like he walked right into a trap Congress set for him.
You could say that. Congress was furious. They saw it as Johnson ignoring the law and challenging their authority. They wanted Stanton back in his job and accused Johnson of abusing his power.
And that's when they decided to impeach him, right?
That's right. The House of Representatives, they were so angry about what Johnson did, they voted to impeach him. It was a historic moment, the first time a sitting president faced such a serious charge. And it started this huge political drama that would change the direction of Reconstruction.
Okay, so now Johnson's been impeached. What happens next? Tell me about the trial.
The impeachment trial was like a showdown, a battle of legal minds and political maneuvering. The Senate, led by Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase, became the stage for this fight.
It must have been intense for those senators, knowing they were deciding the fate of the presidency and what would happen with Reconstruction.
It was a huge responsibility. The prosecution argued that Johnson broke the law by firing Stanton, while the defense said the law was unconstitutional and didn't apply to Stanton's position.
It would have been fascinating to be there, to hear the arguments, to see how the politics were playing out. Who were some of the important people involved?
On the side trying to get Johnson removed, there was Thaddeus Stevens, a radical Republican. He hated Johnson and was really smart. He saw this trial as a chance to finally get rid of Johnson.
What about Johnson's side?
Johnson had a good team of lawyers, including William Evarts, who was known for being a great speaker. They argued that Johnson was acting within his rights and that the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional.
So it was a battle of legal experts, each trying to convince the Senate. But it wasn't just about the law, was it? It was about what would happen with Reconstruction and who had the power, the president or Congress.
Absolutely. A lot of Republicans wanted to use the trial to get rid of Johnson because they saw him as blocking their plans for a fairer Reconstruction.
But some Republicans weren't sure about removing him. They were worried about setting a bad precedent and causing instability.
It was a difficult decision with a lot of different factors to consider, and as the trial went on, no one knew for sure what would happen.
So how did it end? What was the verdict?
It must have been a nail-biter as the Senate got ready to vote. The whole country was watching, knowing this decision could change history, and it came down to the wire. Johnson avoided being convicted by just one vote. He stayed president, but his power was basically gone.
One vote. Amazing. It shows how history can hinge on tiny moments, on one person's choice.
It does. And even though Johnson survived, the fight for racial equality continued. Reconstruction went on, but it faced even more challenges as white Southerners resisted and violence against Black Americans continued.
It's crazy to think that Johnson almost lost his job over this fight about Reconstruction. But even though he stayed president, he was pretty much powerless after that. Congress had made its point.
Yeah, the impeachment trial was a turning point. Johnson didn't get removed, but it showed that Congress was in control. And it led to some big changes like the 14th Amendment and more laws to protect Black Americans and change the South.
And Johnson, even though he tried to stop all of it, well, he was basically ignored. He became a nobody. His reputation ruined.
But even though Johnson's power was gone, Reconstruction was still really hard. Racial violence in the South didn't just stop. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan started to appear, spreading terror and trying to undo the progress that had been made.
It just shows you that progress isn't always a straight line. There are setbacks and times when it feels like we're going backwards.
Exactly. Reconstruction didn't fix everything. It was messy and complicated, full of challenges. But it was also a time of huge change. It set the stage for the civil rights movement later on.
It's amazing to think about how resilient Black Americans were during this time. They faced so much, but they kept fighting for their rights, for a better future. Their stories are so important.
Absolutely. Their courage and activism were what drove the progress that happened. We should never forget their stories.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Reconstruction and Johnson's impeachment, what have we learned? What are the big takeaways from this crazy time in American history?
Well, I think it shows us that democracy is fragile. We have to protect it and stand up for its values, especially when those in power try to undermine them.
It also shows how important checks and balances are. Even though Johnson wasn't removed, the impeachment showed that Congress can hold the president accountable.
And maybe most importantly, Reconstruction teaches us that the fight for equality takes a long time and a lot of effort. What happened during Reconstruction was important, but it was just the beginning of a much longer struggle.
It makes you wonder, what if Lincoln had survived? Would Reconstruction have been different? Could he have brought the country together?
Historians have been debating that for years. Lincoln was definitely more open to compromise than Johnson, but he would have faced a lot of opposition too. It's a fascinating question, but we'll never know for sure.
History is full of these what ifs, these moments where you can see different paths that could have been taken. And that's what makes it so interesting. It's not just dates and facts. It's about people, about choices, and the consequences of those choices. By looking at the past, by trying to understand how we got here, we can learn from those mistakes and try to build a better future.
I completely agree. And if you're interested in learning more about Reconstruction, there are so many books, articles, and documentaries out there. It's a fascinating and important part of American history.
It's a story that shows us how fragile democracy can be, but also how powerful the human spirit is when it comes to fighting for what's right. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another look at the stories that shaped our world.